All right, good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to our work session with the Wake County Board of Education. I apologize for the delay in getting us started. So we will jump right into it. We have one item on our work session agenda today, but it's a fairly meaty one, and that is updates regarding the opening of the school year for 2021-2022. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Moore, and you can get us started.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton and board members. So I'll get us started with a little preamble, and then we'll move into the actual presentation. We're going to share information with you that covers several topics related to the beginning of the school year. Before we do that, I do want to set some context for you. While it might seem like an obvious place to start, I want to start by making clear that the start of the 21-22 school year has not been routine for year-round schools and will likely not be routine, obviously, for traditional calendar schools either. The recent increase in positive COVID cases, coupled with an extraordinarily tight labor market, has assured us of this fact. Let me turn first to issues related with COVID-19. We picked up a lot of hard-earned knowledge last year about opening during a pandemic and operating during a pandemic. Our staff, our students are better for it. It is why you have heard us say over and over that masks and vaccines are our best path forward to ensuring daily in-person instruction. But even those two tools, as effective as they are against infections and hospitalizations, cannot fully protect our staff and students from every exposure to the Delta variant of COVID. So predictably, the biggest challenge we will face at every grade level in 21-22 is limiting exposures. Again, masks and vaccines are critical here. And when that does not work, our colleagues in public health turn to quarantines. Quarantines are extremely effective, but quarantines are also extremely disruptive. They disrupt academic instruction, and more importantly, to our families, they can disrupt the work schedules of parents. But they do work when it comes to stopping or limiting the spread of COVID in our schools. So I encourage all of us to consider the fact that even if we must quarantine a small percentage of students on any given day, that means that the vast majority are attending class in person daily. That is an accomplishment that we might not have even perceived of 6 months ago. And if those staff and students are diligent in following the health guidance, they greatly increase their personal odds of never being exposed or having to quarantine. For those who are exposed, there is a plan to ensure that students can keep up with their lessons. It's not as good as in-person instruction. We've acknowledged that point from the earliest days of the pandemic. What we hope you'll see in the presentation is that there is a plan, and there is policy language that directs how every school will remain engaged with students who are quarantined. The execution of that plan will look different from school to school. And quite frankly, the implementation will probably vary based on the daily demands of teacher and school. But we are confident that this approach offers the best opportunity for students to learn over the course of a full year, especially given the limits of resources. Teachers and school-based administrators do remain the best point of contact for questions or concerns about learning during quarantine periods. I want to be clear that all of the health protocols that we instituted last year still remain. Additional cleaning, hand sanitizers, face coverings, care centers in schools, and we are tightening other practices such as keeping students in small groups, cohort, or podding them, and emphasizing the importance of seating charts in buses and cafeterias where we are requiring them. We have added intervention teachers throughout the district. We have increased social and emotional supports to students through support services. We've added to our health services. This does not necessarily mean that we have everything we need. The labor shortage is real and at times extremely difficult to navigate. You will hear details about that in the slides that are coming as well. But as we recruit employees, we should all remember that the WCPSS is still one of the best places in the state and certainly in the region to work and live. I wanted to provide this context as our schools just like schools across the country, we will do everything in our power to teach students in person every day as safely as possible during the current phases of this pandemic. Little context before we get started. So I'll turn it over now to, I'll go through our desired outcomes, and then I'll turn it over. So we'll go ahead and pull up the presentation. Our desired outcomes for today include providing updates to the board around our family engagement activities that have started, updated health guidance, procedures, and protocols, school-based staffing, and operations details. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Council, Area Superintendent.
Superintendent Moore, Chair Sutton, board members, and staff. It's a pleasure to be able to share some of our school and district engagement highlights with you this afternoon. As we opened up the 21-22 school year, the success we have experienced is because of the commitment to the staff, the school-based staff, the administrators, the teachers, bus drivers, child nutrition services, it goes on and on. While it is true that COVID has continued to challenge us, it is also true that our schools and the district have adapted to respond to what COVID has thrown our way. The greatest joy we have experienced at the on-site of this year has been welcoming back our students and the engagement of our families and the community partners. Our schools have hosted Meet the Teacher sessions, student orientations, and other family engagement activities. Schools have been cognizant of the fact that they were, in some cases, welcoming back students and families who had not physically accessed a school building for over a year. That meant typically, welcome to middle school for sixth graders were also opened up to include welcome to seventh graders. Year-round schools deserve a special shout out as they navigated a quick turnaround between the close of an unprecedented 2021 school year and the opening of the current school year. They picked up where they left off and have persevered in the face of the Delta variant. Our students and staff have shown resilience, and they have operated to overcome new obstacles. Our traditional schools have been working hard and preparing for the return of their students, staff, and families, and they have learned much from the experiences of our year-round counterparts. There is no substitute to having our students on campus and engaged in learning. If you will now turn your attention, we want to highlight some of our student and family activities that have been constructed to welcome back our families for the 21-22 school year. Our first school that we would like to highlight is Wilburn Elementary. They had a Meet the Teacher event, and as a year-round school, Wilburn staff invited students, parents to a face-to-face, external, internal, and virtual Meet the Teacher event held on July 29th from 4 to 7:30. With social distancing in place to the extent possible, parents and students met with teachers outside the school under tents, trees, and any other shade structures possible, while others visited tables getting carpool, transportation, and child nutrition information. They set up in stations under the school's breezeway. One of their community partners, Raleigh North Christian Center, assisted in the event, cheering on the students and the parents and supporting the families however they could. For families that could not attend on that particular day, administration and teachers scheduled virtual and or teleconference info sessions at a later date and time. The next school we would like to highlight is Salem Elementary. They also had a Meet the Teacher event. Salem Elementary welcomed their parents through multiple Meet the Teacher events. They invited parents on tracks 1, 2, and 3 to visit the schools on July 7th, and each track was provided a separate time to visit the campus. Track 4 Meet the Teacher was conducted on July 30th, and a separate Meet the Teacher was held the same day since Track 4 coincide with Virtual Academy. Our next school, we have a middle school, East Carey Middle School. They had a student and parent orientation. And as the traditional middle school, Principal Davis met with their rising 6th grade IMP Academy students and parents on August 12th. 2 sessions were held and organized by their last names. The school shared information about their global studies and world language magnet thing. Students began their adventure by receiving a gold ticket to travel around the world at East Carey Middle School. The day ended with each student receiving the key that would unlock unlimited experiences throughout the school year. The school also prepared a virtual parent information session that will actually be held on August 18th from 3:30 to 14, as well as from 5 to 5:45. Again, multiple opportunities for parents and families to visit the school. And last, we have Knightdale High School. They held a student orientation where they hosted camps for both sophomores and freshmen on August 2nd and August 3rd. Camps were to build school community through the leadership and the energy of their school student ambassadors through the Link Crew, which is a national organization. During this time, students toured the building, they walked their schedule, bonded with their classmates, and met upperclassmen who periodically will check in on them throughout the school year. 4 parent sessions were held during the freshman and sophomore camps to onboard all families. While we had school district events going on, or school meet the teacher and parent information sessions, we also, from a district perspective, we are always thrilled to see the events that happen across the district from all levels. At the beginning of the school year, we see many events like the ones that I've shared in the highlights previously. And as these events take place at all levels, it's exciting opportunities for families, students, and partners, community partners to bond. They are, however, only the beginning of a much more in-depth process of family and community engagement. Next slide. It is critical in our efforts that we consistently remind ourselves that family and community engagement is not an event, but rather a practice. It's ongoing, it's purposeful, it's strategic, it's data-driven, and just as any practice within the district, it should be and remain that way. This past year has provided us with the opportunity to refocus on the commitment to family and community engagement. We know now more than ever that we must partner with families to ensure each of our students are meeting their full potential, both now and the extended pre-K-12 journey. One of the first steps in this commitment is to ensure that we have a common definition as a district for family and community engagement. On this slide, you will see an excerpt from our definition that has been created by a subcommittee of teachers, principals, family representatives, and community partners, and across departmental district staff. It speaks to our belief that with strong family and community engagement, the shared responsibility and commitment to this engagement ensures inclusive, authentic, and accessible experiences that foster academic and social emotional success for each student. We hope that this definition can serve as a compass towards our goal of real connections between home and school for the benefit of all of our students. While there's much work to be done, we have a strong foundation to build on in the Wake County Public School System. A tremendous wealth of knowledge and experience exists in our Title I schools, and we're working to expand that to everyone within the district. Similarly, efforts around family academies through the Office of Equity Affairs and their partners are all well known. Prior to the pandemic, district-wide professional learning activities were held by Dr. Karen Mapp and the dual capacity framework. During the pandemic months, we learned clearly that we must be proactive in ensuring that our families and students are connected to those strategic goals and the work of the district. You saw evidence of this last year from school staff, from social workers, from counselors, from family engagement staff, and others who work to ensure that we did not lose our connection with our families. As we move into the new school year, we're offering professional learning that also allows for school staff to continue learning successful strategies while also providing a forum for staff to share their experiences, successes, and lessons learned to colleagues across the district. Of course, as with any effort, we need to assure that our efforts are effective, which is where family feedback is critical. On our next slide, while we were not able to survey all families about engagement this past year, as we have in other years, the Title I program was able to do this, and their initial results have given us some insight. And overall, it has been very positive. Specifically, in the spring of 2021, the Title I survey showed us that 83% of our families responded that the school communication was helpful. 91% of our families responded that it was easy to get in touch with the school when needed. 90% of families, which was up from 76%, responded favorably to the idea that teachers have respect for their children. And finally, 75% of respondents favorably reacted to the question, how much does the school value the diversity of children's background? This was up from 60%. Now, none of these slides or data points is exactly where we want to be, but they show positive trends. This year, we'll be looking to promote similar increases in student feedback achievement outcomes resulting from family and community engagement practices, and so on. Again, remember, it's not about or just about the events. It's about achieving our goals and making things happen through our partnerships and our shared commitment with families and the community. That brings us to the end of our presentation for the school highlights and the district highlights. And before I close out, I'll be open to taking questions, and I also have a team of people behind me that can answer some questions as well. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Counsel, for that. Any questions from board members? Board Member Scott.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Counsel, for that presentation. It was definitely exciting to see our schools starting out their school years and all of the work from our engagement coordinators and teams. I also know this wasn't on the slide, but Hodge Road Elementary, they had a fire truck come for their first day as they were welcoming students back, and some of their town counselors were there as well to welcome students back. So it's great to see so much involvement. I just had a quick question, though, about slide 10. I don't know if anyone would be able to answer this, but this talks about the 83% responded, but I'm wondering what was the overall response rate in those surveys. I know that they 83% responded that school communication was helpful, which is fantastic, but I'm just wondering, what is that overall percentage of response?
Here comes Brian. Are you talking about the end, the number of people?
Yes.
It's a great question. The Title I team, I think, is still pulling together all of that detail, and we'll be able to bring that back to you, but certainly happy to share that. I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head.
Okay, I think that's important to know overall, because these are the people who are engaged and are regularly communicating, which is great to see these numbers for those, but still just thinking of overall numbers. But thank you. Thanks.
Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton, and thank you for the presentation, Dr. Counsel. And and you noted that many of our students have not been in a school building for more than a year. So are there special strategies or outreach to our schools for those students that may have really turned inward. I'm concerned that many families have been isolated during the pandemic and are now coming back. And specifically, I see Dr. Rangel here. How many languages do we, because we've also gotten feedback that some families are not receiving communication in their in a language they're fluent in. So can we, in a language other than English? And how are we approaching that that outreach as well?
Okay. While Dr. Rangel comes up, I will share with you that schools are reaching out, as they did last year, using, and as I mentioned, using counselors, their social workers, and providing materials to go out in different languages. They're knocking on doors. They are visiting homes, just as they did last year. Principals are dropping off packets, the ones that are already in VA for year-round. And they're still providing opportunities, either whether it's during school hours or after school hours, to answer any questions, whether it's virtually or just teleconference.
Thank you, because I think that certainly can address some of the issues of isolation that I think have risen. Hi,
Hello.
Dr. Rangel.
Yes, also the schools have been very intentional to work with interpreters and translators, which is great. And as we all know, they provide the language support in different languages. Through the Office of Equity Affairs and through the Family Academy, we have been very intentional to provide resources in different languages. Chinese, Korean, Spanish obviously is one of the ones that is requested the most. We've done outreach in English as well, and also in Chinese, and this year we add in French, and we are also adding Swahili into the mix of different languages. And again, we have also been intentional to utilize Facebook as an instrument to get to those families and provide academic support, again, in different languages. And I think that's been very helpful to engage those families.
Thank you both. Thank you, Ms. Chutney.
Ms. Carter.
Thank you. And I did appreciate hearing about being proactive, because I do think oftentimes, I know it can feel like that family engagement just is there to kind of check it off the list. So I do appreciate hearing trying to be proactive. And I guess wanted to kind of circle back to a student achievement meeting in May where it was mentioned about possibly doing some student family engagement activities over the summer. And I know that kind of have gotten changed, and I understand that. But I'm just looking for, as we're moving forward, like more district that was mentioned at that meeting. I don't know if anyone can talk about that, about getting specific feedback from families about teacher resources, things that are working, not working, that kind of thing.
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for the question, Ms. Carter. So we did, at the May 24 Student Achievement Committee meeting, talk at length, I think, about curriculum in general, but also as we look at a multi-year curriculum procurement plan, engaging with the community as part of that effort. And obviously, the plans that we began to lay out in May were somewhat sidetracked with the events of the pandemic over the course of the last couple of months. That said, one of the things that we are doing is providing or setting up a series of instructional videos for families to be released here in the next couple of weeks. We're actually finalizing. They're being closed captioned. Something as simple as providing an orientation to the website and telling folks, hey, if you click on the academics button, go down to homework help, this is what you'll find. Or if you're looking for this, this is where you go to find it. And as we know, sometimes it's not always easy to navigate that. So that is something that we're doing that doesn't require a large group gathering. That said, depending on how things evolve in the coming weeks and months, we're not going to abandon the idea of larger scale regional sessions with parents and families to engage around curriculum. Obviously, it may have to be done virtually, but we're committed to continuing that once the school year kind of gets up and running.
I guess, could we have like a follow-up with that so that we can see like the plan? Because I think it's important for folks, if we truly want them to make time to engage, have a plan, like in a month, 2 months, some type of time frame. I don't know.
So we can go back and figure out what makes sense, but it's really best for families to hear directly from their schools. That's where the relationships are strongest and formed, and that's where they're really paying attention to. but we'll figure out how we can outline what we're asking schools to do and what kind of timelines they have and provide that information.
Mrs. Cash.
Sometimes because of the amount of people that come to a school, I think some teachers would like to have their encouragement from their principals to be able to do something by class with their parents, maybe after school or on a weekend or at a park. And I'm not sure our principals feel guided to be able to do that. And so is there some way that we can encourage that?
We do encourage it, and if principals are interested in doing that with where the school improvement team have discussed it, or the leadership team, we can guide them through having something on the weekend. In fact, a couple of my schools have done that over the weekend. I think Fox Road has been one of the schools in the past that has events over the weekend. I believe Forest Ponds will have something, or have already had something, on a Saturday.
So I guess and I get that, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm talking a little bit about teachers individually, asking to be able to go and meet parents of their students at a park on their own, and not necessarily be a school event. It would be a school event, but I think they want to do more of that in the classrooms. Is that a possibility, or is that discouraged? I'm just trying to understand.
I think that you may need to give me some examples offline of the kinds of things that you're talking about, because we also have field trip guidance that we provide to teachers about how you engage in activities with families, and so we'd have to make a distinction if something's happening off campus and it involves students. Is it a field trip? Is it not a field trip? Is it just an opportunity? And because I think we want to promote the engagement, we just want to make sure that we've got the right processes or structures in place that define what it is or isn't and how to go about doing it.
What about if it's on the school, after school, but just a class gathering of parents to meet the teacher?
On school grounds, there should be clear opportunities to do that. It's the off-school grounds that gets a little fuzzy.
Okay.
Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. So this is sort of a transition from family engagement to the health guidance, but I've received inquiries from a number of parents lately that have asked about whether schools could take any role in providing more health information to families. A lot of that information is information that it's of concern to school families, students, and parents, but we might not be the best people to provide it. And I didn't know if there's any opportunity to partner with county health officials or medical professionals, or make some of those resources available through some of our family engagement.
Again, I think that's a really good idea. I might need some examples of specifically what you're talking about, but I think that the owner and expert of the information, and if you're talking about the schools sometimes being a conduit for that, I think that is appropriate.
It would be something that we would facilitate, not something where we're trying to answer the questions ourselves, but
Right.
rather just pointing people to resources.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Seeing any further questions, we'll move to our next phase of the presentation.
Thank you.
Paul Coe, with health updates, health guidance.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Good afternoon, Superintendent Moore and board members. To continue our presentation, I'm going to be presenting to you an overview of our health guidance updates. And I'll be sharing some key factors related to our context, as well as insights into the recommended guideposts we should monitor as suggested by our health partners. And next, we'll dive into our health guidance updates and look more closely at the latest updates and what they mean for our schools. And to close this section, we'll provide you an update on access to instruction during quarantine. So as always, our health guidance aims to strike a balance between two priorities: keeping our schools open for daily in-person instruction and keeping students and staff healthy. And this balance is not always easy to achieve, but if we follow all health guidance with fidelity, including adhering to our 3 W's of wash, wait, wear, we believe our district can be successful in reaching both of these goals. And as you know, COVID-19 transmission and positive case numbers continue to trend upwards. And at the same time, the updated NCDHHS guidance no longer provides explicit statewide requirements and instead offers what schools should or could follow. And within this context, and to help us balance keeping school buildings open and ensuring staff and students are healthy, all of you voted unanimously at our August 3rd board meeting to implement a universal pre-K-12 face covering requirement. And our public health experts from Wake County and ABC Science Collaborative have encouraged our district to focus on following guideposts when we consider changes to health guidelines. The first was an increase in vaccination rates among school-age population, somewhere between 70 and 90%, while simultaneously monitoring other factors. Currently, we have 59% of 12 to 17-year-olds have at least one dose of vaccination, and 53% are fully vaccinated. A second guidepost was a significant decrease in positive cases over 2 incubation periods of COVID-19, which is 28 days. And we need to monitor this regularly. And as I noted before, the positive cases are still trending upwards. We also need to keep an eye on our cases per 100,000 per 7 days as a way to understand our positive case numbers and compared to other counties and states. And currently in Wake County, when I looked up the numbers today, we are at 604 cases per 100,000 per 7 days, which is up from 492 about a week ago. And we'll also monitor the number of clusters.
Paul, I think those are the 14-day numbers. They're high.
Oh, okay.
They're not the 7-day numbers. The 7-day numbers for Wake County are 303.8 right now.
Yep. That might be my mistake, Dr.
No,
Moss. I appreciate that.
it's the confusion. The North Carolina Health and Human Services website number, where they give the population weighted, gives 14 days, but most people are used to the 7-day.
Got it.
So
I'll take a look and
it's confusing.
Yeah, make sure that I'm correcting it.
They don't publish the 7-day, which is what's frustrating.
Got it.
You have to get the total number of cases and know the population and calculate it yourself, which shouldn't be the case, but it is. But it's 303.8 right now.
Got it. Thank you, sir. We'll also monitor the number of clusters in our schools, and we're currently at 6 clusters, which is up from 4 last week. And we will continue to look at our hospitalization rates and the number of deaths we are seeing due to COVID-19. As of August 16th, we had 230 patients, while on August 1st, we had 120 patients in Capital Region hospitals. And our death rates are relatively flat, though there were 3 deaths reported on August 11th. This context underscores the critical need for all students and staff to understand and follow all health guidance. We must ensure that we are practicing the 3 W's of wearing face coverings properly over the nose, mouth, and under the chin, practicing physical distancing as much as possible, and practicing proper hand hygiene. Our health guidance is designed to minimize clusters and the spread of COVID-19 so that we can maintain our focus, keeping schools open for all students, for daily in-person instruction, and keeping students and staff healthy. We want to keep students in the classroom, and to do that, we're going to need everyone to work together, and we urge families to heed safety precautions in school and, just as importantly, outside of school. And in our year-round schools, our contact tracers are seeing how off-campus gatherings can quickly affect an entire classroom when face covering guidance is not followed. So we want to keep students in the classroom, and in order to do that, we need all of us to work together. And I wanted to take a moment here to define clusters within our context. And so per North Carolina DHHS, in a child care or school setting, a COVID-19 cluster is defined as a minimum of 5 positive cases identified through a positive molecular PCR or positive antigen test that results with illness onsets or initial positive results within a 14-day period and plausible epidemiologic linkage between cases. Following this guidance, how we determine a cluster is when 5 or more cases have this epidemiological link. And what that means is that there's a common denominator of where and how people were exposed to COVID-19, for example, whether on a bus, a swim meet, or a classroom. And as our schools continue to use mitigation strategies against this rapidly spreading variant, our 3 W's will be essential for our ability to minimize clusters and the spread of COVID. And I really wanted to emphasize how the COVID that we were seeing in the 2021 school year is very different from this Delta variant. It's a much more transmissible version of COVID, and it's something that we need to keep in mind because the numbers are not apples to apples. And our ability to minimize the spread of COVID and clusters, it'll also help us maintain our focus on our priorities of keeping schools open for daily in-person instruction and keeping students and staff healthy. And as a final point for this slide, we also think that our ability to focus on our two priorities by minimizing clusters and the spread of COVID can also support the strain on our staffing context, which will be discussed later in this presentation. Ms. Mahaffey.
Mr. Coe, when you say the epidemiological link for these clusters, whether that link occurred outside of school as a point of origin or inside of the school, we are still required to report it as a cluster at the school, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
Ms. Mahaffey. So
Thank you.
that's what the common denominator, whether it happens in the school or out of the school, if there is that common denominator, that is the epidemiological link.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yep. Ms. Cash.
How does that cluster then affect the quarantine in the school? So if a group of kids, like in high school, hang out together and they're 5 or more, and they come to school, how does that cluster affect the quarantine of the rest of the class that was not hanging out with them?
Well, it depends on I guess, on a case-by-case basis, Ms. Cash. So if the students who were, you're saying the 5 students who were in high school, if there is a common denominator in how they got exposed to COVID, then there can be an epidemiological link. But if they were at 5 separate things and they've all happened to be positive, those are 5 separate cases that don't necessarily have an epidemiological link.
They're all linked,
If they are all linked,
and then they come to school, that doesn't mean there needs to be a quarantine for the class based on a cluster.
yes, it depends on the case. Like our contact tracing efforts and our local public health department would determine what the quarantine situation would look like, and then determine, is it the whole class that's exposed or is it a few students? And also, are face masks, face coverings worn properly or not?
If the students are in school and have been in school and potentially exposed other students, what has to happen, that's the contact tracing that happens, where our staff and the health department determine, even though these kids may have caught it or whatever off campus, if they came onto campus and were positive on campus, they need to check to see whether or not any other students may have been exposed. They do that through the questions they ask through contact tracing. If the other students in their classes, in the hallway, and everywhere else that they've been with students are wearing masks properly and consistently, then there may be no exposures. And we've had cases during the course of the school year since we've started with year-round where we've had no exposures. And we've had other cases where there's been uncertainty and there have been exposures. So it is still an individual case tracking down that has to happen if a student who is positive or an adult who is positive is in our building. Regardless of where they got it, if they're in our building, we have to contact trace any potential contacts within the building.
And it's the health department then, based on that contract tracing, deciding whether it is a mandatory 14-day quarantine or mitigation efforts can be used to shorten the quarantine? Is that?
Yes, Ms. Mahaffey. And then the contact tracing would determine, are there any exceptions where quarantining might not be necessary because face coverings were worn properly and consistently?
So my concern here is that sometimes when people don't get exposed because they've worn their mask, people like to say, well, I'm not sure that I didn't. So the minute they say, I'm not sure, when actually they are probably pretty sure they didn't come into contact with anybody with a mask, the health department's going to go right to the 14-day. And so I think we've got to be so careful that we make sure everybody understands this, because one teacher saying, I don't think they did, or I'm not sure, is going to give us the worst quarantine we can get when it's probably not necessary.
That is a potential, Ms. Cash, so I think it is important to reiterate what your point is around making sure that we know all of us are following the 3 Ws at the least, and then all our health guidance protocols as well.
Dr. Martin.
To extension of this, do we have any, I know we don't have the exact number, but do we have an approximate number of how many people get quarantined for every case? I mean, is it 1 or 2? Is it 5, 10?
I think it depends on each case, Dr. Martin, and then I think, we are keeping track of like what cases and how many exposures there potentially are, and it's part of what we're working with ABC Collaborative on, but in terms of making sure that those numbers are confirmed, we're actually checking in with them tomorrow, and I think we can get you more solid data around that after we connect with them about validating that data.
So do we have even a ballpark? I mean, can we assume that basically for every case, some are, in addition to the person having it, are usually getting quarantined? I mean, I don't think we're talking about a dozen or a classroom every time.
No, I
I think it's probably more like 4 or 5. But
well, I mean, I'd have to confirm a little bit more with Dr. Benjamin, but the range can be 0 exposures, right, per case, up to, we've seen, much higher numbers that go even into the 80s and 90s sometimes.
So are you saying we as Wake County Schools are not tracking the number of children that are quarantined?
No, we are tracking the number, but we're just but the part about validating the data with ABC Science Collaborative is making sure that what we've reported is as there's fidelity in what we've reported, and we're just confirming with them that the numbers that we have tracked are correct. So in terms of being able to report it out, we don't want to report out unvalidated data.
I appreciate the desire to be accurate, but if a person is quarantined, they're not in our school, they're not in the classroom, and I guess I was maybe going to save the question for later, but how do quarantines impact our ADM? I think that's going to be important down the road because, for example, last week there were 133 student cases, 129 from the week before.
Yep.
So we're talking between 250 and 300 cases. Clearly, all of those are out. But, I guess for semi-easy figuring, if there were 5 cases for 250, that's 1,250 students out. Mm-hmm. Now we're talking numbers that impact our ADM. I think if a student is out sick, they don't get counted toward the average daily membership. If we've got 1,000 out, now we're starting, because I think you have to be, there are some numbers that are attendance and some are the total membership. And maybe it's excused, unexcused. My question really is, how is all of this impacting things like ADM? Because I think we need to think about that very seriously. That's partly going to be my question as we talk about what do we do for our quarantined students, because we can't afford to really have 1,000 people out not counting toward our membership because we're still working with those children. Does that make sense? That's why.
Well, you're correct.
We've got to know these numbers, and this idea that ABC Collaborative has to validate it. No,
well,
we have to validate it, and they maybe need to know it to help us know what's going on, but we need to know what we're doing.
So one of the things, I mean, there are a number of strategies that we're looking at, but you are correct that if students are counted absent due to quarantine, during that first 20 and 40 days of school when we are reporting to DPI, it will impact the ADM. It is one of the reasons that superintendents across the state of North Carolina are requesting that this be another year that districts are held harmless with the ADM, because we are seeing, particularly now, as we see the surge in cases, and we know as school's starting, and we can see just in Wake County that started a month ago that we do have quarantines. So it will impact that. So that's something that we have advocacy around at the DPI and state level. To the other point, it is a range. Could be 0, and when Mr. Coe said up to 80, when you end up in a situation where you've got an exposure potential in a cafeteria that may not have had a seating chart, recess that didn't keep the kids potted together, buses that couldn't confirm a seating chart, those are the times when you're going to get higher numbers of exposures. And those are the things that we are having to tighten down on and provide specific and explicit direction about to schools in order to minimize those exposures. So as we collect this information and we try to figure out, it's also a moving target, because sometimes we had a case last week where a student who wasn't initially part of the contact tracing family reported the student as positive, and it turns out they were an exposure, but they weren't on the initial contact tracing list. So it's a moving target that changes. And we are working really, and that's part of one of our priorities when we meet with the ABC Science Collaborative this week is what is the best way that is both efficient and provides good information around the numbers of quarantined students that actually helps us with learning what we need to learn about keeping kids in school and keeping them safe.
Sure, I understand and appreciate that. I'm just, and obviously we don't have the numbers right now, I'm just a little bit concerned because we need to know which students are in school each day, right? If we're talking about every school, every
Correct.
child, every day, we need to know if they're there or not. So this is where I'm struggling a little bit with this idea that we need somebody else to confirm our numbers. We know whether kids have been in school or not. And if an absence, right, we need to know if it's unexcused, we need to know if it's quarantined, we need to know if it's whatever it is.
And I don't think
So we should know those numbers.
I don't think it's the numbers. I think it's the category, right, and how we report it. Because we have looked at, for example, the overall attendance rate in a building on any given day, because we could look at that number as the high end of what could be the quarantined number of students in a school. So you could pull the daily attendance for any school, and whatever the number of students were that were absent for that day could be the high end of what, that would be the high end, because some of them won't be quarantined students that are absent.
But that's only going to be if we're talking self-quarantine, right? So self-quarantine could get it up. But if we, the school system, say, you can't come to school because you're quarantined, don't we have to know that number? And we don't need that externally validated. We said, you don't come because you're under quarantine. That's the number that I want to know.
Right, but yeah, and because of also the ones that can come back more quickly than others, that number changes, and you're counted 1 week, but not the next week if you're on a 14-day, but if you're on a 7-day, you're only counted 1 week. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. We're gonna figure it out,
Right.
and there are other.
It's daily out. That's
And I think-
not a hard number.
And the other thing that's really important here to understand is that as the district tries to figure out how to do these numbers, because in other places where quarantine numbers are being provided, that comes from the county fully owning the contact tracing and quarantining process, which is not the case with Wake County. So we have to partner with that, because we're doing and hired a lot of contact tracers ourselves because the county needed the support in terms of being able to do that. So how we're collecting the information is a little bit different than what's happening in some other counties that are smaller.
And Dr. Martin, if I may add, we will get those numbers and bring them back to a future board meeting, and we'll make sure that we clarify the questions you had during the session.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And this, Mr. Cook, I'm glad to see you there because Superintendent Moore, you said that students who are in quarantine are listed as an excused absence. So when it comes to teaching and learning and the access to the educational program that students are getting with checking in with their teacher, what does that look like for a student if they're doing their work, I mean, I hate to revisit the attendance policy, but if you're quarantining in order to keep other students safe, do you see where I'm going with my question?
Yeah, and I think there are some slides a little bit later on that Drew and Paul will cover together
Okay.
around that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you wait because I anticipate we need to talk about that too.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Hegarty.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. And again, this is something that we did talk about in policy, and there was debate, from some of the policy committee members about whether or not these absences, when you are taking a student out of school who the only reason for taking them out of school is proximity to a possible case, right? And they have to sit out for such a long period of time without being offered instruction like some of these options. Is that an unexcused absence? Is an absence? Or could you provide some sort of educational opportunity and then still have them, receiving instruction if not present? And somehow not avoiding those things. It was a sticky question, and we sort of, I don't know that we delved as far as we needed to go in committee on these types of situations. But my question is, and this goes to the points that Ms. Mahaffey first raised and then Dr. Martin had alluded to before, and that there are a lot of questions right now about quarantines and quarantine procedure. And I know that you've done a great job answering them each time we bring them up. But what I'm wondering is, could we develop something, a communication tool for parents, maybe something as simple as like a flow chart that could kind of very simply and easily show what is the process for quarantine and what are the factors where there's a decision tree? What's the impact of vaccines? If your student has been vaccinated, how does that impact your quarantine? If you're unvaccinated, how does it impact the quarantine? What is the impact of a test? In what situations could a student test negative and then reduce their length of quarantine? In what situations would that test not reduce the quarantine? If that's something that you could, your staff or communication staff could work to develop and provide, I think it would address a lot of the same questions that a lot of us receive on a regular basis.
Yes, sir. I think that's a great idea, and we'll take a look at that.
Thank you.
Mrs. Carter.
Just really quick, kind of following up on the quarantine numbers, is there any way that we're going to, or will we reach a point where we will be able to post that on our COVID? Because that, to me, I get a lot of requests for that. Not only just us getting that information, but having it out there, breaking it down, having like a rolling tally even, because I think that's important to show. Are we going to
And
reach
that's
that point?
that is part of the conversation
Okay.
that's happening tomorrow, is what is the most efficient, effective, actually gives us information way
Right.
so that we could expand the information that we're providing publicly.
Okay.
But people need to know what it means and what it represents and where and how we came up with it. So yes, we are. That's part of
I
what we're
just
looking
wanna
at.
make- okay. All right.
Trying to figure out. And because some other districts, like I said,
They
have
have.
done it previously, but those are actually county numbers that were being provided. So.
Okay, and just to piggyback on the communication, if part of that, to me, I think would be helpful to have, I don't know, just my opinion, the responsibility and who makes decisions, like the final authority with Wake Public Health, and having that clearly communicated, because I do think that's important and can get lost sometimes because, there is some overlap with different roles, but where the ultimate authority lies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
Mrs. Cash.
I think that I like Mr. Haggerty's idea, and you've probably thought of this, so I'm not. I do think it's good for the parents to know, because I think sometimes even our teachers and school administrators get confused on this and may take them out 7 or 8 days. If they need to be out 7, they may take them out 8. And I think it's good for us to hear from the parent if they know what should have happened, because that'll help us keep our quarantining down. And I think it's just a check and balance that's good. And then I just want to follow up for the county's sake, is I don't want them to think that quarantining children out of school for 14 days is stopping the spread. It's stopping the spread in the school, because these kids that are asymptomatic, they are going to be in the community. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want them to think by any means that that's helping their spread in the community. It's only helping the spread in the school.
Yep. So that maybe I'll
wanna
get to
continue?
continuing the
Yes, sir.
presentation. Before we pause for questions, we were about to go over taking a closer look at our updated guidance that went into effect yesterday on Monday, August 16th. And so links to this guidance have been included at the top of the slide for your reference. And I wanted to start by highlighting some of the changes and new points of clarification. And as I noted before, all of you voted unanimously on August 3rd to mandate a universal pre-K-12 face covering requirement. And some specifics around that is that for our pre-K programs, in alignment with NCDEE guidance, which includes students ages 3 to 4, face coverings are strongly recommended. And one point of clarity here is that when students are taking naps, they should not be wearing face coverings, but instead spaced out appropriately. And all students ages 5 and above across our elementary, middle, and high schools are required to wear face coverings indoors and on WCPSS and vendor transportation. And in terms of the use of additional PPE, equipment beyond face coverings is now limited to specialized medical procedures as outlined by our school nurses. So the use of things such as face shields, gowns, and gloves will be per the guidance of our medical experts at the campuses. And now let's talk briefly about quarantine. Students who are, and I know that there were some questions from you about these, but currently what's listed in the Strong Schools Toolkit is that students and staff who are sick, experiencing symptoms should only be excluded for these DHHS identified COVID-19 symptoms that are fever, chills, sore throat, new cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, new loss of taste or smell, diarrhea or vomiting, and severe headache, especially with a fever. And if someone is experiencing one of these symptoms, they must meet one of 3 pathways to return, and these include a negative PCR molecular COVID-19 test, an alternate diagnosis, or presumed to be positive and they stay home for 10 days and then return. And when students and staff experience other symptoms that have not been identified by DHHS as related to COVID-19, such as an earache or rash, pre-pandemic health practices should be followed, where 24-hour fever-free, or where the students are 24 hours fever-free without the use of fever-reducing medication, and that anyone with an undiagnosed rash, red watery eyes, inability to attend to learning activities, or change in usual medical status be sent home. And when a student or staff member is exposed to COVID-19, we will follow the DHHS and CDC guidelines for a 7, 10, and 14-day time period to return. And then exceptions to having to quarantine include those who are fully vaccinated with no symptoms, or they have tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 3 months and recovered and do not have symptoms, or they wore a face covering appropriately over the nose, mouth, and under chin and consistently. And this applies to both the person with COVID-19 and the potentially exposed person. And if an unexposed person starts experiencing symptoms, they cannot return until they meet the requirements for someone experiencing a symptom of illness. If an exposed person tests positive for COVID-19, they cannot return until they meet the requirements for someone diagnosed with COVID-19. And so for quarantine guidance, we follow the guidance as I've noted on page 15 to 18 of our North Carolina Strong Schools Toolkit. And so that's related to just kind of COVID and exposures and how we handle the cases. And then the second item I'll go over is for our guidance regarding recess. Little has changed. Face coverings are optional outdoors, but in addition, we've recommended a best practice to cohort students in smaller groups while students are outdoors during recess, lunch, or outdoor school events for contact tracing purposes. And in terms of eating and drinking guidance, we have a list of items that we want schools to implement. We strongly recommend that groups of students should move from classroom to eating area together in cohorts, and that these groups are not mixed for pre-K-8. Where practical, a classroom seating chart should mirror where students sit in the cafeteria. Next, we are required to ensure that students have face coverings on properly over their nose, mouth, and under chin while getting food, and students should only remove face coverings while eating. We strongly recommend that proper hand hygiene is practiced by students prior to entering areas for eating and drinking in all areas. And then we want to make sure our students are practicing physical distancing as much as possible. Students are able to punch in their student ID in a keypad and serve themselves. The risk of COVID is less through touching surfaces or items, and more through the spread if students are not properly wearing face coverings or properly distanced when getting food. And the way that our health services team has mentioned through Kelly Creech is that it's more of a respiratory infection and rather than touching, and I'm sure all of you know that. Another item is that we're saying that students must be seated in seating charts for contact tracing for pre-K-8, and students should eat outside when possible. And eating time should be minimized, where masks are being removed no longer than 15 minutes at a time as much as possible. And students may talk within the group of students that are seated next to each other. And we are noting that off-campus lunch privileges at high schools may continue. And as before the pandemic, any food in schools for students or staff should be commercially prepared and individually wrapped. And no food from home should be shared with others, but pizza from Costco can be shared with proper hand hygiene. And this should be consistent at athletic events, and students should not be sharing food with each other. The next item around our updated guidance is for visitors and volunteers. We note that schools should continue to limit non-essential visitors, and the school may decide who is essential and non-essential. and visitors or volunteers who are required to wear face coverings properly over the nose, mouth, and under the chin at all times while indoors. And visitors should self-monitor for symptoms, practice hand hygiene, and maintain as much physical distancing as possible. And questions for self-monitoring should be posted near entrances of schools and WCPSS buildings. And for transportation, in addition to the face covering requirements on our buses and vendor transportation, we have noted that seating charts are required and students not be switching seats at any time. For field trips, we noted that day field trips are allowed with the requirement that all protocols are followed. However, all overnight field trips are paused indefinitely until further notice based on district review of COVID-19 metrics and guideposts. All field trip requests should be reviewed both at the school level and then by our area superintendents. And we recognize that many schools have already planned or hosted, as you heard in the previous section of this presentation, of hosting open houses or other parent, guardian, family engagement events. And so schools may continue to host these open houses, family engagement events virtually or via small cohorts in staggered times. And schools may host events indoors. And small cohorts can be defined by the school whereby attendees can be physically distanced at a gathering as much as possible. And the DHHS toolkit recommends that schools should maintain 3 feet of distance between students and 6 feet of distance between adults. And everyone, again, must follow the 3Ws protocols. And schools should maintain lists of attendees by cohort for potential contact tracing needs. And outdoor events can occur with no limitations on number of attendees, but physical distancing should be maintained as much as possible. And again, food should be commercially prepared, and all attendees and staff members should practice proper hand hygiene prior to eating. And similar to what I've noted before, for food sharing amongst staff, it must be commercially prepared, proper hand hygiene, and when eating, maintain as much distance as possible. And for WCPSS staff gatherings, we've noted that indoor gatherings are allowed, face coverings are required for all, and must be worn properly. And staff cannot exceed normal room capacity or table seating capacity. We're essentially noting that please don't pack like sardines. And we want to encourage seating charts and the 3Ws, and as much as possible, small groups during these staff gatherings. And we want to make sure we're minimizing transitions and have our presenters move more so than the groups of attendees. And we want to, again, just maintain as much physical distancing as possible, and outdoor gatherings are permitted with physical distancing, and face coverings are optional outdoors. And we're also noting that we should offer synchronous, asynchronous sessions for professional learning days along with our in-person sessions. And finally, there are some new guidelines for learning for students when quarantined that I'll cover later in our presentation. And now I wanted to shift over to what has remained the same with our guidance. And so these items include that the process for reporting positive cases is still with our health services team in partnership with Wake County Public Health. Our face covering accommodation request for students remains the same, and a friendly reminder that the accommodation follows the student wherever they go and is not about the location. Our face covering accommodation request for staff members also remains the same. Our care centers are still required, and the guidelines have not shifted. And when someone is diagnosed with COVID-19, they must still isolate for 10 days. Our water fountains are closed, but bottle filling stations are okay to use. For our athletics, band, co-curricular activities, and PE, our guidance remains the same, that face coverings are required indoors during practice and during indoor home or away competitions. And a best practice is to, again, cohort students in smaller groups during practices and activities. And health guidance, our health screening guidance remains the same, where we continue to expect all staff, students, and visitors to self-monitor, and the screening question should be posted at the entrances to all schools and WCPSS buildings. So with our updated health guidance and our health guidance that has not changed, we wanted to summarize this section of our presentation with a reminder of our mitigation practices that we've had in place and will continue to implement, as Superintendent Moore mentioned in her opening remarks, that we're continuing to require face coverings for all students, staff, and visitors. We are making sure that there's a face covering requirement for students, staff, and vendors on WCPSS transportation vehicles. We're providing face coverings for staff and students as needed. We're providing and using hand sanitizers as part of our 3Ws practices. Social distancing to the extent possible in classrooms and other spaces. We are requiring seating charts in classrooms, cafeterias, and on buses. We're grouping students for recess, lunch, and other activities. There's daily cleaning of school buildings. And our air filters were changed and upgraded during the 2020-2021 school year, and we will continue to be using them and replaced as needed. And the final topic in this section that we'll provide you with is an update is access to instruction during quarantine, which, as you know, has become a more critical issue as positive case rates and the number of corresponding quarantines have continued to increase over the past few weeks. As you are all aware, this is a highly complex issue involving multiple and at times competing factors and consideration, which include individual student learning needs, those in quarantine, in person, and in the virtual academy, and potential negative impacts associated with concurrent teaching and or increased virtual academy class size. Simply put, it's critically important that as we work to provide instructional opportunities to students who are absent due to quarantine, we're careful not to negatively impact instructional opportunities for others, either by overloading sections of virtual academy courses or by reinstituting the widespread use of concurrent teaching, a practice that we all know is far less than ideal both instructionally and from a teacher workload standpoint. And speaking of teacher workload and staffing capacity, these are two critical factors that impact what can realistically be provided to quarantine students. Aside from the heavy burden that concurrent teaching would place on teachers, there are also limitations on what teachers and instructional staff can be expected to do while spending their full day providing instruction and support to their in-person or virtual academy students. So with that context in mind, we believe there are some effective strategies that we can engage in to support students in quarantine, though to be clear, none will rise to the level of the full day live instruction that was regularly available as needed during concurrent teaching and or temporary virtual academy enrollment last year. And so first, as indicated on this slide, there are some general parameters that Policy 4400 and 4400 RMP provide as a baseline of support across our district. Specifically, Section 2C of 4400 RMP indicates that daily communication will occur with the student. They will have access to meaningful and aligned learning resources in paper or online will be provided, and students or families should not go for multiple days without receiving individualized communication from their teachers. And additionally, if all instructional requirements are met when a student is quarantined, the student will be held harmless for the purpose of school system defined activities and awards. And while the RMP provides general parameters for instruction during quarantine, this slide provides more detail on additional school and district level supports outlined in updated guidance being shared with schools this week. All schools will utilize the Students Learning Management System, LMS landing page, and Canvas or Google to support students who may be absent. The Learning Management System landing page will provide students and families a consistent location to find information about the course they are scheduled in. Information posted may include items like assignments, readings, classroom activities, links to instructional videos, rubrics, assessments, family homework support resources, and other instructional materials. Teachers will also update this information regularly and will orient their students to this page. Additionally, school staff will provide regular live office hour times for student connection, engagement, and direction for instructional support each week. When feasible, district-level instructional support and live office hours will be made available across grade levels and content areas to supplement what schools are able to provide. This may include contracting with WCPSS teachers across grade levels and content areas. And finally, when quarantine requires the entire classroom to quarantine, the class will become virtual when feasible, including live instruction for the duration of the quarantine. While we recognize that these strategies can never replace full-time live classroom instruction, we do believe this approach effectively balances the various factors and considerations that are involved. That said, staff will continue to investigate additional systems and structures that may serve to strengthen support for quarantine students without overtaxing teachers or negatively impacting the majority of other students who are not in quarantine. And I'm sure you have many thoughts and questions on this and all the other information that I've shared. So at this time, we're happy to take questions, and we'll do our best to provide some useful responses along with our team members from Academic Advancement who are here in person and online.
Very quickly.
All right, I'll start with Mrs. Scott, and we've got a couple of updates after this one, so you could kind of keep your questions sort of tight.
I will do my very best. I thank you for the information. I know this was a lot, and I appreciate you putting this together. I feel like this is really helps me as a board member understand what we're navigating here. But I do just want to acknowledge, I was talking with a few colleagues earlier, that this is such a more of that unpaid labor, more burden on our teachers, and there's a lot of that is out of our hands. We're all doing our best right now. And I just want to acknowledge that and thank our educators. I think it's important to acknowledge the giant lift that everybody is going through. On slide 20, with the reaching out, the daily communication with the student, and I'm asking this because of some feedback I specifically received, so I don't know if this is a widespread concern, but would parents or guardians, if they opted out of talking points, would that impact whether or not they're receiving information from teachers? Like if they said, don't send me the text, don't send me the emails, at the beginning of the year when you have that ability, would that impact this communication?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Scott. Honestly, I don't know the specific answer. My first inclination is that communication still needs to occur with the student, irrespective of whether or not a student opted out, even if that means another means. But I'll let the experts speak to that.
Sure.
No worries. Good evening. So if they've opted out of all communication, then parents will not get that communication. However, what we're talking about, as Mr. Cook mentioned, is communication with students. And that does still have the ability to occur with or without a parent opting into communication or not.
Thank you.
Well, we also have ways of calling if we need to, individual calls. There's lots of ways for us to reach out, not through school messenger as well, or talking points. We have a whole plethora of ways to do that. So.
I appreciate that, because I was even thinking, I don't know if this is a possibility or a bigger lift, but if office hours are not necessarily, I know that's, again, a burden on the teachers, but if there's like a help desk queue sort of type thing where we could, ask a question like, hey, I didn't understand problem 38, or, and then that can, I don't know if that's a possibility.
Sure, we've already had lots of that in the last year. They call the technology help desk, and we try to refer them either back to the school. But Mr. Cook and I have had several conversations about ways we could better route some questions from parents and students that way, so that they get the answers they need. So
yes.
We are looking at a variety of different options.
That's great. Yes, because the technology help desk was such a success, so I wondered if something similar could be applied over to students. And the landing pages for Canvas or Google Classroom, is that something which is always a great tool for parents anyway to have access to that? So is this something that it's just sort of like, this is your expectation this year to make sure that's updated regardless of if a student's in quarantine or not?
Yes, ma'am. Great question, and the answer is yes, irrespective of quarantine status. Beginning this school year, the expectation across the district, and we've done it, we've got a year of experience under our belts, is that every teacher across grade levels and content areas will have Google or Canvas as a landing page, which, as many of you know, has an abundance of instructional resources and information available for students and their parents. But I would also say that's still not the same as live instruction, right? And we recognize that and acknowledge that. And so I think that the other area that we want to work to help support schools with, because we all know and recognize we can't ask teachers to be two places at once. Well, I guess we can. We did that last year. It was called Concurrent Teaching, right? We can't ask teachers to do that for another year and expect that the level of instruction will remain at a high level. And so without moving students into and out of virtual academy temporarily, as we did very often last year, and without providing concurrent teaching, which is the expectation that teachers are going to teach both the students that are in front of them and whichever students might be quarantined or absent at home, if we're not going to do those two things, and I think we all know and recognize why we can't do that, then that places a premium on our ability to find some other mechanisms to provide some level of live support to students. And so I think there on slide 21, you may have noted, I believe the third bullet is an area that we're investing a lot of time and effort in around what can we do as a district to help supplement what teachers and schools are already providing in terms of those live weekly office hours and check-ins, all the communications that are occurring. And so part of that may very well be contracting with our teachers to provide additional support outside of the realm of their professional responsibilities in a day. It can also mean that we're looking at digital vendors that can provide contracted online tutoring for students during the school day. So we don't see this as being kind of a one-size-fits-all. Quite frankly, it will be a moving target. Going back to Dr. Martin's questions earlier about the number of quarantined students, it's going to be important for us to have some idea about what those numbers are, what grade levels they're in, what courses they're taking. And so I think it's fair to say as hard as we'll work to provide that live support, it's not going to be something that can be available on demand across the entire district in every single course that students might take. But I do think that it's far more than what you might be able to just see reading those three bullets in policy R&P 4400. And I think that's a lot of the work that we're engaged in the last couple of weeks. We cannot continue to ask our teachers to be two places at one time as they did really in perpetuity for all of the 2021 school year.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you. Two very quick questions. On page 7, talking about athletics, it lists the updated guidance. At one point, I know there had been some talk, or some other districts had proposed testing, COVID testing for athletes, but I don't see that in this guidance. Is that still under consideration, or has that been decided?
Yeah, that's going to be something that we also discuss with our ABC Science Collaborative. Is like, given what our context is, what are the best mitigation strategies, and is that one of them that they recommend?
Thank you. And then the last thing, Superintendent Moore, I know we had talked a little bit individually about options for lunch, bringing in volunteers or seeing if there's money for staff, something that could be done. Is that something we can revisit in a future meeting?
So right now, we're asking our area superintendents to work directly with principals on all of the possible options that are available for what can be done at lunch. And for example, we may have some schools that, based on the size of the cafeteria and the day, have a pretty compact lunch schedule. But we may have other schools that are already starting lunch at 10:30 in the morning and go till 1:30 in the afternoon. And then we have some schools that ordered picnic tables and put a bunch outside last year, and some that may not have. So we're looking at all of those options right now so that each school, based on their facility, the number of students, and the staff available, can figure out what are the best options for them to spread kids out during lunch. And then, in addition to that, if we're opening up the opportunity for volunteers to come in school, is there a role for volunteers that can come in school that can support during lunch as well? If we go down the path of trying to hire folks for a couple hours a day, that is a possibility. I think let's do what we can in the buildings first, and then see what we can do, with spacing them out and the tools that we already have in place, and then see if there's space or need for additional tools, and which schools have those needs. So because it may not be all of them.
Thank you.
Mrs. Cash.
I just had a quick question. So you asked about outside space, so we're going to have to probably give that to most of our schools. But in addition to that, I know that last year principals were saying they didn't, like CNS needed to maybe help, Ms. DeLuca's here, they needed some help in delivery of some of their food in different locations in the school. And if CNS is unable, we need to probably get volunteers to help them, because that was a big problem.
Right, and that's another aspect of potential volunteers in a building. that, I just have to offer a couple of caveats, right? So in addition to the cafeteria staff, which has a high vacancy rate, you'll see in just a few minutes if you have not already, needing to be in the cafeteria to serve the over 90% of students who are in the school building, there are apparently problems in our supply lines and with the packaging and stuff that you need in order to move food out of the cafeteria into other locations. And so that's a problem also. But it is something that if it fits into the strategy of school based on the number of people they have or the support or help that they have, it could be an option. I just don't think it can be as widespread a strategy as it was last year. And that's because of personnel issues, quite frankly.
Okay, and then just quickly, so we will hear from our parents the minute there isn't any instruction going on during quarantine. So I guess, do we then just forward that to our area soup? Because that's going to happen.
Yeah. I think that's what we have been doing at this point is, sometimes they've spoken with the teacher and or the principal and they've not gotten relief. The area soup is the best person. Starting with obviously your teacher and your building level admin, but if it needs to be escalated beyond that, the area superintendent is the right person to go to.
And Ms. Cash, I'll just add, we've also discussed, going back to Ms. Gaddis, the possibility of creating a separate Let's Talk channel to funnel specific inquiries around quarantine instruction, perhaps even doing the same thing with Virtual Academy so that those questions go directly to folks that can provide immediate assistance.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you. All of this is very complicated, but more complications on its way. And I think we know that, and we need a plan for it. I appreciate the guidance that you listed, thinking about what are the guideposts that we're paying attention to, and I think they're the right ones. The question that I have is, at least the focus was more, what are the guideposts before any restrictions can be released? But this is the steepest surge that we've seen in the pandemic. We have more cases in our schools than we have ever had. We told parents when we were trying to get people to sign up for in-person versus virtual that there'd be two things that would be considered for reopening Virtual Academy and or I'll add to that other restrictions. Now, none of us want to have everything going virtual again, but like I say, things are going worse than they have ever been. So I guess the question that we as a board need to understand, maybe we need to weigh in on, but when we told parents we would re-examine, I think a lot of people heard that if there was a surge, Virtual Academy would reopen. Fully understand the staffing issues. There is no easy answer here. But I do think that as a system, we owe it to the community to be clear, what are we going to use to define a surge that says we've got to take some more extreme action? If we could reopen virtual at all, and like I say, I understand the staffing issues, so this is non-trivial, but could we voluntarily reduce the population in schools until we don't get to a situation where we have to put everybody into rotations or remote? I'd love it if we'd see a downturn and this was all worthless talk. But like I say, the steepness is going up. There's no sign of flattening or downturn in sight. And our 5 to 17-year-olds have now matched where they were at the peak in January. And it's going worse. So when are we going to make decisions to go to the next steps? How are we going to be transparent to the community when we said we would open up other options if there's a surge? What's going to define a surge for us to take any of those actions?
Great question, Dr. Martin. And obviously it's one that we continue to wrestle with. First of all, I think it's important for us to state clearly, reevaluate is present tense and ongoing and not past tense. At this point, based on the continuous reevaluation that we're doing, looking at surges, numbers, case rates, quarantines, school capacity, demand and need from parents and families, and significantly, and we'll talk more in just a few minutes about our staffing capacity, staffing capacity is a key guidepost in determining our ability to open up, quote unquote, virtual academy to anyone and everyone at this point that may want to come in. And I will say, the district has worked to be exceedingly flexible. If you'll recall, going back to April and May, and recognizing we were asking families to make a decision where we were all hopeful but uncertain about the future. If you'll recall, those initial numbers after that first enrollment period were around 12 to 13,000. We created and instituted, based on all the feedback that we were receiving from the community, as numbers continued to improve, as vaccinations became more available to the 12 and older population, we set up a mechanism to allow families to move out of virtual academy back into schools. Ironically, most of the movement that we saw over the summer, just until the past couple of weeks, were families moving out of virtual academy and back to in-person. Sure. So I want to be clear that flexibility and that desire has been there all along. To your point, now we're seeing...
If I just might add, I think that's in part because there was trust that we communicated that if there is a surge, we will act.
Correct.
So I'm completely in agreement with you, but I do believe it was based on that point of trust.
So the second part of the equation, of course, is now we're seeing the pendulum swing back in the other direction.
Correct.
And so here is the choice. This is the choice that we can make as a district. We do not have the capacity, despite the fact that we have added nearly 200 additional positions across the district to support the virtual academy, to create a separation from school allotments, right, and from the district, so that we've got more flexibility and movement and room for kids to move in and out. The fact of the matter is, and you'll see this in a few minutes, we haven't been able to fill all of those positions across the district. And so that means we don't have room as a district for additional students to move into the virtual academy at this time. Now, we can make a decision as a district if the surge continues and we see larger numbers of families, larger numbers of students getting sick. At some point, we can make the decision that we would collapse, for example, in-person sections where the vast majority of our current students are, and move them into virtual academy sections. The implications of that are pretty clear. In other words, that impacts students who signed up to be in person, which right now makes up about 93% of our district. So we can collapse sections and start moving teachers into virtual academy to accommodate additional families that wish to move in. That's an option. Right now, we've determined that's not an option that we're ready for. Correct. Now, I think we also have to recognize that conversely, 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks from now, if we do that, we may have to move back and do the opposite in reverse. And so you're absolutely right. It is a very, very complex and difficult issue, and right now that's where we are.
Thank you. I understand the complexity. It's planning that, sadly, we have to be doing, or we're going to be caught unawares.
And we are.
All right. Let's continue with the update.
All right, thank you. I believe I'm passing it to Dr. Mutillo.
Good evening, all. Drew, thank you for the references to staffing and the transition here. Here today to bring you an update on teacher and instructional assistant staffing as we approach the first day of school for traditional calendar students. We have been surveying principals monthly regarding their staffing needs since December of 2020. Principals reported updated teacher and IA vacancy numbers with us as of August 13th, just last week, and the information I will share with you today comes from that latest report. It's also important to remember that during this point in the hiring season, our numbers do change daily, if not hourly. Our team continues to process an average of 50 hiring recommendations each day. Once candidates are approved, we move them through the hiring process, including orientation, as quickly as possible. First, I want to give you a data point to highlight where we are overall with teacher hiring. Among the 11,975 teaching positions, which includes general and special ed teaching positions originally allotted to schools, we have 206 vacancies. This puts us at a rate of 1.7% among the teacher positions originally allotted to our schools, which is slightly higher than the 1% vacancy rate we tend to have this time of year. In addition, the district has added nearly 500 new positions to support virtual academy and intervention efforts during the pandemic, and these additional positions may be contributing to the increased vacancy rate that we're seeing. So let's look closely at a few categories. First, general ed teachers is highlighted in the first column. These are the positions originally allotted to schools, most of which are supporting in-person learning, but some are also supporting VA. We have 10,140 general ed teacher positions in this category and 151 vacancies, which provides us a vacancy rate of 1.5% for our regular ed teachers. Next, we'll take a look at special education. During your last meeting, you approved a $3,500 recruitment bonus for special ed teachers hired between July 1 and November 21st. At this meeting, I shared with you that principals reported 105 vacancies among special ed positions at a vacancy rate of 6.8% at the end of July. As of last week, principals reported they are down to 55 open special ed positions, which cuts that vacancy total in half. However, vacancies in this column also include 30 additional special education virtual academy positions. When you add these 30 vacancies to the other 55, we still have 85 special ed teacher positions to fill at a vacancy rate of 5.3%. While this is encouraging to see a decrease in the rate, the remaining vacancies will impact students that we serve. For example, among the 55 vacant positions, about half, 26, are in our regional programs. We have a total of 378 regional program positions, so that vacancy rate is slightly higher than the regular special ed rate at a 6.8%. We know these students in these programs will be more successful with a permanent teacher in place to address as many of these positions as we can. Virtual academy staffing numbers are highlighted in the third column there. Among the 703 total virtual academy positions, which include school-based and the additional district allotted positions, we have 130 open positions at a vacancy rate of 18.5%. And the rate for these positions is much higher than we had hoped at this point. Central Services VA team continues to work closely with principals to fill these vacancies and mitigate the impact on students. Final column includes an update on instructional assistants. When you approved the $1,200 recruitment bonus for IAs during your meeting on July 20th, we reported 296 vacant positions at a rate of 11%. We are now down to 287 at a 10.3% vacancy rate. We know that we need to make more progress here, as these are critical positions that support both students and teachers. So in summary, we're seeing really solid rates when you look at a 1.7% or a 1.5%. But that does not tell the whole story. There will be students at every level who will begin a new school year without a permanent teacher or instructional assistant in their classrooms. And there will be virtual academy students, particularly at the high school level, who will log on to find a sub teaching one or possibly more of their courses. As we've shared with you before, to ensure that students begin the school year with quality instruction, some students may also be enrolled in NCVPS math and science online courses, which are commonly used within our high schools. These courses do not feature live instruction. When you think about how we're working to address these current VA challenges, this highlights why we are unable to let additional students into VA at this time. As you will hear later in the presentation, staffing shortages are not limited to our instructional positions. We continue to see higher vacancy rates among transportation and child nutrition services as well. And we also are not the only ones with these staffing challenges. It's been a challenging labor market for all organizations, even outside of public education. Add to this that the past 2 years have been incredibly challenging to our employees who work in schools. These employees have been essential workers on the front lines since the beginning of this pandemic. And these two factors are a part of the landscape that makes it difficult to find candidates willing to fill our critical vacancies. So we do continue, though, to recruit targeted by using targeted landing pages, linked from careers page, LinkedIn, social media. Resumes are received directly from these platforms and passed on, and like I said, we're continuing to get about 50 recommendations in a day. We're also pulling lists from our applicant tracking system and reaching out to applicants who may not have gotten one job to let them know that we have another job that they may be qualified for and interested in. We've had some success with the virtual information sessions as well. Compensation also continues to be key in our ability to attract and retain talent. And in addition to recruitment bonuses you've already approved for special ed, we continue to explore increases for compensation for our existing employees. And while we'll continue to move with these strategies, we're also looking at other ways to reduce the number of subs who need to address staffing gaps. Last Friday, we sent a survey to all middle and high school teachers to gauge their interest in teaching a VA course during their planning period and being paid for the additional time that it will take to do the planning outside of their workday. We've heard from more than 200 teachers who are interested, and we're now working to match them up with student course schedules. So far, this seems like a promising option, as it already appears we may be able to address nearly all of our middle school needs through this particular strategy. Our special ed team is also reviewing this planning option and beginning the matching process to address some of their vacancies as well. Despite these efforts, we know we will need to continue to utilize subs to ensure we have coverage. In response to that need, we provided funding just in the last day or two to have one permanent sub assigned to each school every day to support classroom coverage needs as they arise. I recall some board members have mentioned this at times, even prior to the pandemic, and we've used some variations of this throughout, but this could be a good support for schools. And to ensure subs have instructional materials they need, teams and central services are also working to create lesson plans for VA courses. Know that as we move through the school year, we will continue to explore all options to support schools in finding and hiring candidates, as well as other strategies to secure classroom coverage as a result of our remaining vacancies. At this time, I'm happy to take questions, feedback, and comments that you have.
Before we get into any questions, let's go ahead and finish the last operations piece. I think they're on the 2 slides, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Chair Sutton, board members, Superintendent Moore, thank you for the opportunity today. In the interest of time, I only have the 2 slides. I'll be brief with my comments, but relevant with them as well. You've heard about the challenges throughout these presentations that we have with labor, and it specifically affects transportation and our school nutrition program. Absolutely. So I'll go off script quickly and hit the relevant points. We have a almost 17% vacancy rate in our transportation department. Now, we do have the first day covered. We have 675 positions and 627 routes, and that's the good part. But there's some pain that comes with that as well. So although we have all of the routes covered, we will accomplish that by having double runs at over half of our schools. It's a necessary part of how we're operating right now with the bus driver shortage that we have. We've also reached out to our schools and asked them for some grace in terms of allowing us some additional time, both in the delivery in the morning and the pickup in the afternoons, an additional 10 minutes, so we can kind of stretch the window out with those buses that are doing additional runs. We've talked to our bus drivers. We've gotten some feedback from them, and they know the challenges that we face. We'll see different routes this year, and in some cases, different drivers on those routes. Again, it is necessary for what we're having to do with the number of employees that we have to drive buses. As AJ mentioned, the recruiting process is still going strong, and we continue to recruit on a regular basis. Next slide, please. And speaking briefly about child nutrition services, the picture is not quite as good. Our vacancy rate is just north of 27%. We are struggling to get and maintain qualified staff to work in our school cafeterias. With that issue in mind, our menu offerings this year will be limited. We have less people. We don't have the ability to offer as many products as we have in the past. We have issues with getting product, in some cases, from our suppliers. Superintendent Moore mentioned earlier, it's not just the food sometimes, it's also the packaging. The first week I got here, Ms. DeLuca met with me and discussed the issues with trying to get containers in which we could package food. They simply weren't available from the vendor that we had always worked with and that we were under contract with. We're looking at probable reductions in curbside meal service. Our focus has to be on the students that are in the building. We have to work to service them and feed those meals first. I mentioned briefly the product shortages that may cause menu changes. Again, we have to substitute all the time. We have to go with the flow. And then just as a side note, if you've been through a drive-through recently, you may have noticed that they're always asking for a card or exact change. And so we're not insulated from that either. So we will probably be experiencing coin shortages, much like everyone else. And if and when that does happen, we will just credit the additional money that the student would have gotten back to their lunch account for use at a future time. And I know I've been brief and quick, but in the interest of time, I went off script, so I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I appreciate you, sir, and welcome.
Thank you.
For your first time. Mrs. Carter.
Just a couple things. Because I'm hearing this last part of the presentation, and if there are any families that are listening, they're probably like, okay, how is this all going to work out for them, their family? And I know the double back routes are, I know as a parent what that is like. It impacts a lot. It's like kind of like a rolling thing. So how soon and how detailed will families be told this information directly, and how it will particularly impact their family? So they have
We
been
already have.
Okay, well, they're not.
The bus time and everything.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
And it was bolded in that email
Yeah,
we
I've heard
got saying, there is a shortage. But I think, to your point, Ms. Carter,
Right.
you don't know until you experience it that
Right.
first day.
Okay. And the other question I had was kind of circling back to the staffing issues. And I know from how I'm reading this, we're going to be relying a lot on subs. So my question kind of related to that is, how has the sub-bill rate been looking for our year-round schools this so far compared to previous years? How are we looking? Did we do outreach to all of our subs to see with the current situation where they are? Are they still willing to come in? That kind of thing. So.
Yeah, so great questions. Thank you for bringing them up, Ms. Carter. Our sub-fill rate started out great in July. They were in the 90%, pretty similar to what we see in year-round. Come the last week of July and early August, they started dropping. I think there was an 88% that last week in July, and then we were down into about 75, 78% is what we've been running over the past couple weeks. So that's where we're standing now. We have done sub-outreach throughout the pandemic, including heading into this year. And what I've learned with surveys, that intent and responses are not always reality. We have almost 3,000 subs. We had 378 subs who signed up to say they are ready to do virtual academy subbing. That has been a challenge as well. We are reaching back out to them with personal phone calls saying, we really need you, or, can you help us out? So we're doing everything we can with the current sub list to make them aware of our needs and the opportunities to work. At the same time, we're also exploring the building sub, the permanent sub, that not permanent, but the sub that will be there every day will be a good support for schools. And some of those subs who do want to work every day, I think that will be an appealing position and will be helpful. We're also looking at outside vendors to supplement our sub needs as well at this time, something we've not done in the past, but need to explore every avenue.
Okay, yeah, and I didn't know. I know previously there was, something set up with central office staff also that had gone in, or if there's a way to work with Activate Good, anything at all, and I know. But I'm just saying, if we are at this level, to me, these are alarming levels. And we're sitting here saying we're going to rely on subs, and then I'm hearing that we're going from 90 to 75%, and this is with year-round and modified in. When traditional hits, that's a whole, you hit 75%, you're talking a large number of classrooms without either a teacher or a special ed IA. So I'm just, and we have, 6 days.
Mrs. Cash,
I'm going to be quick.
please.
I see you're tired and the doom on your face. I feel bad for you.
I thought I was hiding it better, Ms. Cash.
The mask is covering most of it, but I preface this by saying I don't know what I'm talking about when I tell you this, so it's not a suggestion. But did we ever reach out to the colleges for their students and teaching schools to give them credit for coming in and working as subs?
We have, and we did get some in the spring. We have also recently reached out even to their master's in teaching candidates who are getting ready to student teach to say, hey, how about a job instead? So we're exploring, partnerships and opportunities with universities everywhere we can.
It'd be good if Wake Tech could help because their students don't go to school all day. But thank you. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just saying that.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
I think this is probably for you, Mr. Cook. Literally 6 days away for our traditional schools, and most of our high schools and middle schools who are traditional will just be getting schedules by the end of this week. So the majority of our parents, contrary to our belief, do not listen to our board meetings. So, and especially at high school level, they also don't attend open house. So just my words of wisdom is that we are communicating with parents before that student sits down in that class on Monday that they potentially are going to have a sub for, their core courses. Because that's the number one complaint we got last year, even though we were virtual, and I can only imagine what it's going to be like when they sit in those seats on Monday. And again, that's recognizing that most of us we change our ways as parents as our kids get older.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. And yes, we actually sent a communication out to a targeted group of virtual academy families yesterday regarding exactly that topic. Either today or later this week, we'll send another communication out specifically to those families with a orientation link and a whole list of resources and where to go if you have questions. And as you would expect, we've also got a substantial number of our academic advancement staff that will be spending a tremendous amount of time and energy on day one, making sure that kids have a place to go. And I think what we're talking about, it's always a challenge to open a new school year when you have vacancies in a brick and mortar building. But as a former principal, at least I knew that second block at 9 o'clock, there were going to be 30 kids in a room. I knew where the room was going to be, and I could make sure that an adult was there to provide them with materials and resources. As you might imagine, there's a whole other layer of challenge associated with doing that in a virtual environment. So we do have staff and a team working on exactly that. Yes, ma'am.
Vice Chair Mahaffey.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, but I think really the question is, what is the impact for our students and our staff for both of these? With the double runs, what's the impact for students and staff at the school? And then the impact of our teachers who are generously volunteering to give up that planning period. What's the impact on PLTs and building needs?
So I heard double runs in the first part of the question. I don't think that's mine.
Well,
But
what
I
does
will
that
ask,
mean?
but
Well, what
I'll
does
start
that
with the
mean
second question.
for the staff at the school, right, yeah.
I didn't know if you were talking about a transportation double run or double work or extra work for teachers and the implications of that.
Well, the transportation, but I'm assuming, you answer yours first, and
Yes,
then I'll
ma'am.
try to rephrase my second one to
Yes,
be
ma'am.
more clear.
So that is a consideration that is important to us. And I think especially when our top priority, as we've been discussing for the last 2 hours, is to do everything we can to make sure that our buildings are open for in-person instruction. And so we're going to have to be very careful about occupying our teachers during planning time, for example, whether we're talking about virtual academy or whether we're talking about providing instruction during quarantine on a contracted basis that we were just discussing. Either way, that runs the risk of being one less adult, one less teacher in the building, that if things continue to regress in terms of the pandemic may very well be needed to cover classes to keep the building operational. And so that is absolutely something that we are mindful of. We're keeping track of what teachers in what buildings would be volunteering to do this, not volunteering, they'll be compensated. They're requesting to do it, but the other considerations are important. We're working with principals to have them be aware and kind of support that this teacher or staff member will do this. And so PLTs is another consideration. I think absolutely what that does is it makes it more difficult if a school does have common planning, and not all do and many don't, particularly at the high school level, but that could be another consideration that we have to be mindful of, which is another reason why it's important for us to minimize that practice in terms of its scope and duration as much as we can. Although I think it can also help us fill some of those gaps that you know we have based on those vacancy rates.
So then with the double back runs, and please correct me if my understanding of this is wrong, Mr. Strickland and Mr. Sneidmiller, the bus picks up students from school A that are a great distance from the school and drops them off at the school, and they're at the school for 20, 30, 40 minutes while the bus does a second run for the same school and picks up students who are living geographically closer.
Or it could be the opposite, either way, but still, yes, the double runs are where a bus serves two different routes. And so,
I mean, a huge thank you to our bus drivers for doing that, because that's a lot. My question is, what is the impact of the school-based staff? Because these students will need supervision during that time.
So they've been doing it for some time. Double runs have been a way of life for the district. This year we are having to increase our reliance on that. It essentially means that they will have to utilize some of their time spent doing other things and helping us with those kids coming earlier. It's just a matter of having the warm bodies there to look after them and trying to get them there on time for the start of the school day. So there will be some changes for them, and they'll have to modify the things that they do, particularly in the mornings and afternoons.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin.
Dr. Matillo, two questions. I emailed you late last night, actually early this morning. First, I was pointed to the Apple-Track, and on the Wake County Public Schools Apple-Track, this says elementary school, as of late last night, says 372 elementary school teachers, 215 high school teachers, 184 middle school teachers. Those numbers don't mesh with the numbers you presented. Help us understand these numbers versus the presented numbers.
Sure, and it's a great question. During this busy hiring season, taking postings down is not always a priority for HR. In fact, one of my staff members reminded me today, you just sent us 3 emails with 3 priorities. Which one's supposed to be a priority? So that does fall a little behind because it's a manual process on the staffing administrators to close it, so they tend to stay open even after we have filled the positions. I have asked them to take a look at that so that could be more reflective. For us as a staff, it's actually not a terrible thing to have a position posted a little bit longer, especially as we're trying to reach out to candidates who are applying to these positions. So it is a bit of a benefit, again, to the candidate. It may be not, a little bit of an annoyance, but again, it could result in a call from someone in HR to say, hey, we've got this position for you. But yeah, it's really due to the manual process and at this time of year, just not being able to prioritize that position closing.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then the other more substantive question that I also asked, what is the distribution of the vacancies across the county? Are we seeing sort of equal vacancy issues? Are we seeing more vacancies in our high-need schools? What are we doing to make sure that high-need schools aren't disadvantaged?
Sure, and I appreciate you sending that early so I could do at least a little bit of research prior to today. And I pulled it. It a bit depends on the definition of high need. So what I pulled in reference to your question is, what do our Title I schools look like as a group? What do our schools that are identified as low performing look like as a group? And actually, they were pretty similar in nature. If you looked at, the fact that about 75% of our current schools, all schools, have 1 or fewer vacancies. So if you apply that to Title I, it's about 74%, so pretty comparable to all schools. And our schools designated as low performing, again, also at 74%. Their 0 to 1 vacancy was a little different. I saw a little variation there, so that's something that we will continue to look at. I did see more discrepancies in kind of the area of the counties when I looked at those reported. So you had some that were fairly low to some that were fairly high. So, I mean, we've talked about regions under the county as well also being challenges at times. So that's also something that we're taking a look at.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, seeing no other questions, Superintendent Moore, any final comments? You want to wrap up? Anything? Okay, all right. Well, then this will adjourn our work session. We'll, as swiftly as we can, try to move to our public meeting. That will start shortly. Thank you very much for joining us. Gotcha. I was just about to text you and say, okay.
Friend of mine said, watch out for this one.
Dennis?